Okay, so my name is James Mattis. I'm not that James Mattis. I'm the other James Mattis. It's actually very funny because I own all the James Mattis social media handles in the world, and I get a lot of very interesting stuff coming my way. I was actually just contacted by a reporter for GQ from Kabul last week asking for an interview. I'm thinking they weren't actually trying to talk to me, but hey, that's okay. So anyway, this presentation came out of a question. I was walking out of swim practice over at Stanford, I think it was September, and Kyle was asking me about Q rings, and I was running Q rings. He's like, what do you think about it? And I'm like, wow, that's going to be, there's not a short explanation for why they're awesome, but they are awesome. And basically, I wanted to come give a longer presentation on why they work so well. So the question, is like, what is up with these funny shaped chain rings that I've been running on my bike for a very long time? Well, the answer to that is this spreadsheet. Back in 2004, I was sort of working on a project, KLA-10 Core, where I had to do some very complicated simulations of laser transmission through different types of atmospheres. We're trying to sort of tune how to fire a laser through a DPV laser through a media. We didn't want to have a full vacuum, and so I ended up working with this very complicated spreadsheet which had a very big Visual Basic program inside of it. And as I was making these computer simulations, I was sort of thinking to myself about pedaling technique at the same time, and said, you know what, I could take this spreadsheet and modify it to look at some pedaling technique physics as well. And I haven't actually shown anyone this spreadsheet until now. Like I said, there's a very large Visual Basic program within it that is pretty complicated. It models the entire bicycle dynamics, and one thing in particular that I've never seen in another model, and I don't know if you guys have ever used Analytical Cycling, that website. I don't even know if it's still around anymore. It's quite a nice website, but all the models in there just basically treat power as a constant number. And I wanted to look at what happens when power is actually like how you're pedaling, it's non-constant. So there's kind of three lies if you have a power meter that your power meter is telling you while you're riding. The first of these lies is that your power is constant. Your power is actually not constant. But when you look at the number, it'll sort of sit there at maybe 300 or 250 watts, just kind of nice and steady if you're pedaling along. The second lie is that your cadence is also not constant. In fact, if you were to look at your angular velocity through a pedal stroke, you kind of are going, so if you're pedaling along and the thing says 90, it's probably really 93, then 87, then 93, 87 over the course of a single pedal stroke. And finally, as a result of the first two items, your speed is also not constant. It's slowly accelerating and deaccelerating every single pedal stroke. So why is your power not constant? The main reason is that basically all of you push down on the pedals better than you pull up. That's just kind of the nature of human muscular structure. So if you were to look at pedaling power versus time, you have a strong push, a fairly weak pull, followed by another strong push and a fairly weak pull. The pull for most people isn't zero, but it's also not much. All right, so what does this mean? Basically, every time you push down, there's going to be a little acceleration of the bike and you on the bike. And when you pull up, because you're not getting enough power out anymore, the bike's going to deaccelerate a little bit. And this is pretty critical, and you can fine-tune how fast you're going by how you actually do this. To explain this, though, I'm going to have to explain a little bit of bicycle physics, and this is where the physics section of this presentation comes in. So I don't know how many of you actually taken physics, but I want to kind of briefly run through some stuff just to make sure we're all on the same page. Now power, which is what's being measured on your power meter, is a combination of your force times your velocity. This can also be written as torque times angular velocity. So when you look at the actual power you're putting out at the pedals, it's a combination of the angular velocity of the pedals, or the RPM, times how much torque you're applying to that crank arm. And also, from the perspective of your bicycle and the rider as a system, power is equal to the aerodynamics power that's required to overcome aerodynamic drag and the power that overcome gravitational drag. And this is sort of a simplified model of it, where aero drag has some constant coefficient times the cube of your velocity, and gravity drag has some constant coefficient times just velocity to linear power, so no power at all there. So when you're on a flat road, there's no gravitational drag in that equation, right? Because it's flat, so you're not going uphill, not downhill. It's just purely aerodynamics. Just that first part of the term. And that v cubed term is really important. So as you apply power, it takes a lot of additional power to get any increase in velocity. Similarly though, when you're on the upstroke and pulling and not getting as much power out, you don't deaccelerate very much either. It's sort of a very constant, steady speed on the flats. And if you flip that equation around and look at velocity instead of power, you get velocity is 1/3, the third root, cube root of your power. So small deaccelerations coasting, and it's also very hard to accelerate the bike. On a climb, you have the opposite problem, where it's basically gravity dominated. There's a small amount of aerodynamics, but for the purpose of this discussion, we're just going to sort of say aerodynamics is 0. And in this situation, it's a much larger deacceleration when you coast. So when you're on a climb, it's more detrimental to be not pulling up as well and not be as smooth. So to maximize speed, pedaling, you can actually adjust your speed for the constant power by what you're doing. On a climb, if you focus on pedaling smoothly, try to pull up more, apply power over more of the pedal stroke, you'll actually go faster. And this is something that came out of these simulations I was running. You can get about maybe a 10th of a mile an hour extra speed by just pedaling a little bit better. On a flat road, that doesn't matter so much. What really matters is the maximum power you get out during the pedal stroke, and so you kind of just want to mash the pedals as hard as you can. It actually ends up being slightly faster. Now let's kind of go back to the physiology thing. There's another interesting factoid that kind of comes out of this. When you're pedaling only half of the pedal stroke, more or less, if you're looking at your power meter and you see 300 watts on it, it's not really 300 watts. It's 600 watts, 0, 600 watts, 0. And it's a much higher number than you actually expected. It's something like that, right? Or maybe like 590, 10. When you see that, if you look at that, if you're now thinking about the number you're normally seeing on the screen, and you think, oh my God, it's actually about double that number, you want to be very mindful about what you're doing with that. So when you're thinking about power, you kind of want to think about the discrete power generation versus continuous. Now when you're seeing like a steady 300 watts on the power meter, that's kind of the continuous process through the whole cycle. But really what it is you want to think about like doing a single leg press with the equivalent of 600 watts on that leg press sled, and then kind of the recovery. In the human body, recovery is more or less due to how fast the waste products, like the lactic acid, can be transported from your leg muscles by the action of the heart and the blood to the liver to get disposed of. Or also, you can also transport the lactic acid from some muscle cells to a different area. So for instance, your legs to your arms in swimming. And that's kind of a constant value. So if you can kind of reduce the peak power numbers and pedal at a lower wattage during the power, you're actually going to be generating less lactic acid during the production side of it and still have the same clearance numbers. Now, let's kind of come to the Q-ring section of this. Typo there. So on the Q-rings, if you think of a round ring, first of all, like a 53 tooth chain ring, basically what they do on Q-rings is they've kind of squished it. So you end up, a 53 tooth chain ring becomes a 50 tooth chain ring in one direction and a 56 in another. This isn't exactly true because they have a continuously changing curve, so it's kind of like it starts at 53 and then it's like 52.1 and 50, so it's constantly changing through the pedal stroke, but it's kind of a good way to think about it. It's just there's two axes. If you've seen those weird asymmetric chain rings that are kind of a bit more lobular, those things actually do have basically two different chain ring diameters and no intermediate transition. So for the Q rings, the way they're set up, that wide section, the 56 tooth section, is during the down power stroke. And if you ever get a set of Q rings, they have a specific little marking for where you're supposed to actually install it on the bolt circle. So you're supposed to orient it in a specific fashion relative to your crankset. When you have it oriented like that, the 56 tooth will be on the downstroke and the 50 will be on the upstroke pulling. So what this kind of implies is if you're measuring 90 RPM on your bicycle, it's really like 85 RPM when you're pedaling down and something like 95 RPM on the upstroke. So you're spending more time pedaling down than you are pulling up. What this sort of means, you're spending 5% roughly more time spent in the push power part of the stroke. And we go back to what we were talking about on a climb where sort of lengthening out your pedal stroke and pedaling more smoothly helps. Just switching to Q rings alone gives, in the simulations, about 1/10 to 2/10 of a mile an hour extra speed on a climb. Just doing nothing. So if you're still seeing the same power number on your power meter, you should just be going slightly faster by switching to Q rings. Which, when I saw this, I was pretty much, this is why I went out and bought Q rings right after this. Now, another interesting fact, though, is because you're spending about 5% more time in the power stroke, you can think about that average power, too. So if it's normally 600 watts for you during the push-down portion, because you're spending more time in it, that roughly translates to maybe 560, 570 watts now. The average is still the same, so you're still having to kind of, over the continuous definition of it, you're still having to clear the same amount of power during that pedal stroke, but you're not generating as much lactic acid as you push down on each stroke. Because the amount, it's sort of like you're on a leg press machine now, instead of having 5 plates, you only have 4 plates. And I think for most of you, you know, if you could push that much weight, you're now like, wow, that's quite a bit easier, right? So a big question is, how do these actually feel? When I've actually gone out and measured it, I have lots of SRM data for the last 15 years on pretty much every road you're going to find around here. They are slightly faster on long climbs. It's due to the nature of how good you can measure speed. I'm not entirely confident of where it lies, but it does seem to be about 1/10 of a mile an hour on a long climb like Highway 9. And that's pretty big in most events, right? I mean, think about Ironman in Kona, where you have sort of a set of rollers and a long, steady climb, right? Like that's a perfect place for where these could be applied to give you a big speed advantage. Another interesting thing is when you're doing a long ride, I find that in the long ride, what you might normally, your experience of, wow, I should feel this tired, you just don't feel quite as tired anymore. And that's probably due to the fact you're not, in each pedal stroke, you're pushing a little bit lighter load. I also think I'm getting a slightly higher anaerobic threshold. It looks around 5 watts. Most power meters are only good at about 5 watts accuracy, so it's kind of in the border range of like, I'm not sure if the power meter is totally correct, but I do calibrate mine fairly frequently, so I'm fairly sure it's giving me about that number. And another interesting thing is, coming back to that equation for power being equal to torque times the angular velocity, when you're on a dirt road climb, because the power is during the actual stroke is going down, I find you don't break your rear wheel loose as much because you're just basically not applying as much torque to the ground. So if you do a mountain bike race or a cyclocross race, these would be particularly valuable because you can just basically climb stuff that other people can't. A few caveats about them. When you first try them, they will feel weird. Everyone, if you've been biking a bit, your brain is sort of wired to pedal at a certain cadence and a certain style. And when you put these on, your timing is going to be off. You're just going to feel like, I can't pedal anymore. For me, it took about 2 weeks to sort of start to feel like normal again, where I'm like, okay, this isn't weird. But I'd safely assume 2 months, so don't put these on like the week before a big race. In fact, if you're planning a race now in October, it's probably the time to try them. Give yourself plenty of time to try them, and if you don't like them, get rid of them. That's kind of the final caveat on these. There are a couple people who I deeply respect who tried these and don't seem to find any benefit from them. So there might be some other factors in terms of your exact muscle structure, maybe leg length, stuff like this is also having an impact. And we've just not been able to sort of sort it out between us. There's not enough data points we've had between us to figure it out. So that's basically it. That's why I use Q rings. Anyone have questions or